Seize the day. Grab the bull by the horns. Grasp the nettle. Take the leap. Today I want to talk to you about a subject that's really rich in metaphor, but actually quite light in detail. I want to talk to you about a subject that, paradoxically, its presence doesn't guarantee success, but its absence almost makes success impossible. I want to talk to you about courage. More particularly, what is it? Why is it so important when it comes to chasing peak performance? And significantly for all of us here, how do we all get a little bit more of it in our lives? Now, when we see a word like courage, I think our brains instantly go to the far end of a spectrum. And we assume that courage demands heroic acts, running into burning buildings, standing up to violent bullies. Yet, the odds of us ever having to dive into a freezing lake and save somebody or rescue a hijacked plane is thankfully tiny. The courage I want to talk about today is more subtle, it's more nuanced than that, and it's something that I guarantee that every one of us here today at TEDxManchester is going to have to face at some stage of our lives or not. Now, I'm not a great one for quoting academics or philosophers or erudite thinkers, but I'm going to make an exception for today's speech. And I want to start by quoting somebody that I consider to be one of the greatest minds of our time. He also just happens to be an honorary adopted Mancunian, Roy Keane. This pitty quote taken from his first autobiography is actually a brilliant articulation of the type of courage that I want to talk to you around. This is the courage to stand apart from the crowd, to dare to follow our own path, to have the courage to resist people's rolling eyes, mocking comments, or sly asides that they want to make whenever we dare to be authentically ourselves. Now, that's a really easy thing to talk about, but this is why courage is key. It's not natural. The idea of standing apart from the crowd, of daring to follow our own path, to go off and pursue our own line of thinking, is actually psychologically dangerous to us. Part of our survival toolkit is about belonging, being part of a pack, where we feel safe, where we're concerned that people have our backs. So the idea of risking being rejected from that tribe, whether that's personally or professionally, or even rejecting ourselves from it, feels like a psychological death threat that we're issuing to the primitive part of our brain. We know that the biggest predictor of mental health issues, such as depression, comes from when people report themselves feeling isolated, excluded, or alone. So when we talk about this idea of daring to stand apart, we first of all need to confront this big elephant in the room. Why is it so important? Well, to explain its importance, let's have a little bit of a quiz, right? I'd like you to tell me, what do you think are the 5 most common phobias that people here in the UK suffer from? Just shout out your answers if you've got. Spiders always gets an honourable mention. Anyone else? Clowns always gets a mention. Somebody said that. Okay. Now, whenever I ask this question, it always gives me a bit of a laugh because I asked it a couple of years ago when I was in Birmingham. Now, I've Googled this fact, that if you ever find yourself in Birmingham, you are officially in the most landlocked part of the UK. You cannot get any further to the coast than if you find yourself in Birmingham. And I found myself in Birmingham where I asked this question. And there was a guy about 3 rows from the front. He shouted out in a high-pitched voice, "Crocodiles," which still makes me laugh to this day. It's not in the list. At number 5 is claustrophobia. And the opposite comes in at number 4, agoraphobia. At number 3 is a fear of flying. And at number 1 is what somebody shouted out first of all, the fear of spiders. The second most common phobia, though, that most of us suffer from, and at the last estimate, it was around 5.1 million people here in the UK have this, at the extreme end of that phobic scale, is sociophobia, which is a fear of being laughed at, being ridiculed, being isolated, standing apart, going against the flow, daring to walk our own path. So we start to understand why this speaks to our very innate fears about having to be rejected or go on our own path. And yet, this is why it's so important for courage. Being comfortable with this kind of discomfort is the ultimate definition of what we're talking about here today. So to illustrate why it's so important, let me share with you a story of somebody that is almost like the epitome of courage in action. It's a 61-year-old potato farmer from the Blue Mountains in New South Wales. Let me give you some of the context. In 1983, that was the first year in Australia they decided to run an ultramarathon. And they decided the ultramarathon was going to take place between Sydney and Melbourne. It's a distance of around 875 kilometres, about 565 miles. And the athletes that turned up tended to be young, incredibly fit, and tend to be pretty lithe. And then this 61-year-old potato farmer called Cliff Young showed up at the start line. And everybody laughed. When they first thought that he was some kind of fun runner or doing it for a joke, and they explained the seriousness of him, he said, no, it's absolutely fine, I'm going to do it. And they thought it was funny when they asked him to get changed, and he said, I am changed, and he was wearing his dungarees and his wellies from his work on his farm. So this brings us to what the German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer would identify as the first stage of trying to take a new idea out into the world. People will always ridicule it, and people ridiculed Cliff Young for what he was attempting to do. But then stage one became even more pronounced. When the race began and most of the runners ran off in their conventional style, Cliff Young set off in a slightly different way. He shuffled. He had a style where his legs barely left the floor and he took on a shuffling action. And people thought this was hilarious. And most of the younger athletes took the lead well ahead of Cliff Young. But the convention of ultramarathon running is that when you've run for 18 hours, you stop and you go and rest for 6 hours before you get up and the race commences. But nobody told Cliff Young. So after the first 18 hours of the race, he just carried on shuffling through the night. And that was when he started to overtake some of his more better equipped competitors. And that was the moment when in Arthur Schopenhauer's world, we moved to stage two. People decided that he must be cheating. He can't do that. And when they consulted the rule books, they found out it wasn't part of the rules, it was just convention that you were expected to stop after 18 hours. Now, not only did Cliff Young end up winning the 1983 Sydney to Melbourne ultramarathon, he beat the record, he beat his competitors by over 10 hours, and he broke the record that had ever been done in by 2 days, when he finished it in 5 days, 15 hours, and 4 minutes. But the brilliant thing about the Cliff Young story is that when we fast forward to the 1984 Sydney to Melbourne ultramarathon, how many of the competing athletes that year do you think decided to stop after 18 hours and rest for the 6 hours? The answer was none. And the reason I love him when I talk about understanding the power of courage is that if you today were to watch ultramarathon running and you watch it closely, have a look at how a number of athletes will run that particular distance. They tend to do what's called today the Cliff Young shuffle, because it's been proven that not only is it better on your joints, but it allows you to go for a ridiculous length without having to take too much of a pounding. So we now live in the world of Cliff Young. It's what Arthur Schopenhauer described as stage three, where it's just convention. Why would you do anything different? It's obvious. Why didn't we think about this years ago? So all change, whether it's personal, whether it's social, technological, or societal, depends on us having the courage to get through these three stages. Yet, if we've just identified that the thing that frightens us most is the idea of being rejected or laughed at or ridiculed, and the first stage of all change is being rejected, laughed at, and ridiculed, we start to understand why Roy Keane was right all along. It's far easier to stay in our lane, get what we've got, accept the way that things are. And yet, what I've seen repeatedly in my work with elite performers is this quiet courage in action, the willingness to be comfortable with the discomfort, to be able to face it down and challenge the convention by not being afraid of ridicule that comes. So how do we get more of it in our lives? Well, what I've seen is there's three really simple techniques that seem to be consistently applied by elite performers. And I want to share them with you so you can look at how do you embrace them within your world. The three techniques I've identified are they visualize, they catastrophize, and then they find something to energize them. So let's talk about those three in turn. When we talk about visualization, we often assume that that's a skill related to a core task, like catching a ball or coping with a particular move under pressure. And yet it needn't be something that's as particular as that. I interviewed a Dutch footballer called Robin van Persie around this, who told the story of how when he first came to England from the Netherlands, he was regarded as prodigious, but incredibly immature. His manager at the time described him as 21, going on 9, because he was impetuous and indisciplined. And he said in the end, he got frustrated with the fact that he seemed to be betraying his own talent. So he conducted what's known as a Zander letter. It's named after the head of the Boston Philharmonic Orchestra, Benjamin Zander, who would regularly ask his colleagues that he worked with to write a letter to themselves dated 12 months into the future and do it as a retrospective on the year that's just gone, as if you've already lived it. Now, the idea behind this is the prefrontal cortex elements of your brains loves this sense of direction. We're teleological. We like to have a sense of purpose. So by doing this, we start to identify where we want to go rather than where we don't, the opportunities rather than the threats, the possibilities rather than the probabilities that are in front of us. So Van Persie's letter to himself was simply looking back on the year that's just gone and describing what he did want in his life rather than what he didn't. Now, that can be an incredibly valuable skill on its own. But what peer-assessed research tells us is that if we combine it with the ability to then catastrophize, our ability to increase our courage levels goes up by around 32%. Our resilience to be able to deal with those mocking sneers instantly becomes better. So how do we catastrophize? Well, this is a phrase from the psychologist Gary Klein that talks about the ability to conduct a pre-mortem. When you know where you want to get to, your next stage has to be, what could stop me? What could trip me up? What could derail me on my journey? And you work out all the things that are likely to stop you being successful along the way. And then take some time to work out how am I going to handle them should they occur. Now, I interviewed a phenomenal swimming coach called Melanie Marshall, who's the inspiration behind Adam Peaty, the record-breaking British swimmer. And she described how before they left to the 2016 Olympics in Rio, they conducted a pre-mortem themselves. And one of the things that they identified is that what happens if we lose our kit? And yet when they moved from their training camp in Belo Horizonte to Rio to compete in the games, that's precisely what happened. Peaty's kit was stolen. So he spent 4 days walking around the Olympic Village in just a pair of shorts and t-shirts. But Mel told us that because they'd simply had anticipated some of these catastrophes that could befall them, Peaty's attitude was, I knew this could potentially happen. All I need is my swimming trunks and to be at the race at the time, which is precisely what he did as he set not only the gold medal winning time, but he broke the world record in the process of being able to anticipate these problems should they occur. And that leads us then to the third element, the ability to energize ourselves. One of the great concepts of change management psychology is the idea of Cantor's law. It's named after Rosbeth Moss Kantor, a Harvard psychologist, who said that whenever you set out on any journey, there will always be a period in the middle that looks and feels like a failure, where you're too far in to go back, but you're not far enough to get to the end. So every high performer that I've been lucky enough to work with reminds them of what they're trying to do, just to give them the energy when they hit that moment and Cantor's law strikes. Johanna Konta, the tennis player, told us how she writes a reminder to herself on the handle of a tennis racket to look up and give herself a sense of perspective when she feels under pressure. Josh Butler, the England cricketer, told us that he writes the word fuck it on his cricket bat, so to remind himself to play with the abandon that he did when he was a young child. But my favourite memory of what energizing relates to comes back to a book I read many years ago by a guy called Dr. Keith Kent. Dr. Keith Kent wrote a famous poem called The Paradoxical Commandments. And the reason I was attracted to this book is that when Mother Teresa passed away in 1997, when they went through her offices and her papers, one of the things that she had pinned on the wall of every one of her offices was Dr. Kent's paradoxical commitments. And I like this because it tells us that even somebody that we tend to sanctify, somebody that we believe is almost immune to understanding these challenges that the rest of us do, needed to give herself a reminder at times of the importance of energy to keep on with the courage to pursue her own path. And I think it's almost a perfect bidding prayer for all of us that want more courage in our lives to go after our own ambitions. The paradoxical commandments read that people are often unreasonable, illogical, and self-centered, but forgive them anyway. If you're kind, people may accuse you of having selfish or ulterior motives, but you should still go and be kind anyway. If you're successful, you'll tend to win some false friends and some true enemies. But you should still go and succeed anyway. If you're honest and frank, people may choose to cheat you, but be honest and frank anyway. What you spend years building, someone could choose to destroy it all overnight, but you should still go and build it anyway. If you find serenity and happiness, others may be jealous, but go and be happy anyway. The good you do today, people will often forget it tomorrow. Go and do some good anyway. And if you give the world your best, it may never be considered as good enough, but you should still go and give it your best anyway. Because in the final analysis, it was never actually between you and them anyway. Which is the whole point of what courage is. It's the ability to be authentically true to ourselves. Thanks for your time.